Welcome back to the NIL Era podcast. My name is Elise Bian.
And I'm Fernando Andrade. Today we have a very special guest. This is someone who both Elise and I have been wanting to bring on to this podcast ever since we brainstormed about this whole project. And it's someone that we've worked with in different capacities throughout our time at and beyond Cal.
So, with a background in compliance, but now in a new role where he wears many different hats, it is my pleasure to introduce Cal's Associate Athletic Director of NIL, Justin DiTola. Justin, it is so nice to have you with us here today.
Yeah, Elise, Fernando, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And to jump right in and kick things off, like Fernando mentioned earlier, we have both worked with you before. For myself, it was when you were more in your compliance role at Cal. And it's honestly what sparked my interest in compliance and kind of college athletics in itself. So, for our listeners, can you walk us a bit through your career background and how you transitioned into your current role around NIL?
Yeah, definitely. So as you mentioned, I've worked in compliance for most of my career. I got my first role at the University of Oregon. I had just graduated college, played football at University of San Diego, so always knew I wanted to get into sports. Had an opportunity to go work at Oregon. Worked there for 2 years, kind of getting my foot in the door in the compliance unit. Never really wanted to work in compliance. It was just a great opportunity at the time going to Oregon. They were playing for the football national championship. They had, all the flashy uniforms, the cool branding. So it was just very exciting to be there. I ended up enjoying compliance. It was a really good experience. From there, I got an opportunity at UCLA, which was awesome for me to be in SoCal. Was great. Worked with football there, which again, since that was the sport I played, I just really enjoyed it. Was at UCLA for 4 years. It was a great experience, and then decided to go somewhere I'd never been or lived before and go to Syracuse, New York, which was awesome. Spent 4 years at Syracuse. It was a great experience. Again, I loved it. Being in a new conference, a new area of the country, being in a college town, it was awesome. And after my 4 years there, I had a great opportunity to come to Cal to be the Associate AD of Compliance and Student Services. It was a really cool opportunity. I was excited to get back to the West Coast, which is where I'm from and my family's from. Was able to work with colleagues in the Pac-12, rest in peace, that I was able to get reconnected with, which was great. And then about 2.5 years, 2 years into my compliance role, that's when I got my current opportunity, where I'm the associate AD of NIL. And it was an awesome opportunity. Like NIL, as obviously you both talk about a lot, has changed so much since July 1, 2021. And even before that, but it's changed so much. And we knew that we needed somebody in that role to really devote a full week, full day to NIL, to every aspect of it. And it was very exciting to me to hear about what that role was going to be and to kind of help mold what it was. So I was very excited to transition into that role. And I've been in that role for almost a year, which has been awesome. It's been a lot of fun. When I walk into the room now and can help student athletes make money as opposed to tell them what they can and can't do from an NCAA perspective, get a lot more smiles than frowns, which I was used to. So yeah, it's been a very welcomed change. So yeah, about 13 plus years in college athletics, mostly of compliance, and now here about a year in NIL, which has been awesome.
I think that to understand the conversation that we want to have here today with you, especially in your new role as associate director, of NIL at Cal Athletics, I think it's really important to rediscuss a conversation that we've had plenty of times at this point, which is the history of the NCAA. And personally, I don't know many people that can tell it as well as you do. And there's many parts to this, right? You already mentioned July 1st, 2021. But realistically, to understand the full picture, it's important to go back to maybe even 1906. So we'll break this down. We'll go up to the three divisions and then from there. But for starters, how did the NCAA even start?
It's a great question. I'm glad I actually found the document I always refer to when we've had these chats. But no, I mean, it's fascinating. I actually had to put a timeline together when I spoke at a sports law symposium when I was at Syracuse, and it really helped me, I think, understand why we are where we are in college sports with the NCAA and the governance model. But yeah, like you alluded to, in 1906, that's when the NCAA was formed, and it wasn't called the NCAA at that point, but really it was for protecting athletes, right? Like at that time, rugby was one of the most popular sports. Football was growing, but athletes at the time were essentially dying because of contact and physical contact incidents that were occurring on the field, right? So they knew they needed some type of governance structure and model to really protect the athletes, right? Obviously, what they did then, that organization did then to modern day NCAA, I mean, it's over 100 years ago, and things have changed so much. Just think about what's changed in the last 3 years. Imagine the last 120 years almost, right? So it's fascinating. So yeah, I mean, it was founded really as a way for athletes to be able to play their sport really at the club level, right? Or really maybe minor intercollegiate level. And they just wanted some protections and safety, and there needed to be guidelines and rule books, right? So think of it really as a sort of a governance model that was initially founded. And it was part of the college experience, right? Like being able to play your sport while you're in college was thought of as a part of the collegiate experience, just like going to classes, just like networking and getting to know classmates. And it was really founded on that principle, right? There was no such thing as scholarships or money, right? And that's a lot of the things that we talk about today, and you two are both the experts at it on the podcast. So it was really just for about having the ability to play your sport while you're in college. Fast forward maybe 20 years, 30 years, that's when tickets started being sold and the revenues were actually generated from hosting games, right? And so as revenues were increasing in the college space, then certain schools said, okay, well, we have some money here. I want to be able to provide it to athletes in the form of a scholarship, right? And so that's when scholarships actually started being allowed. It was in 1948. Athletes had to at some point demonstrate some kind of financial need, um, and scholarships were capped at really tuition, but that was it, right? No room and board, nothing to what we currently think of as an athletic scholarship. In 1951, the infamous term of student athlete was created, which I think we all, yeah, exactly. That's the reaction I was expecting there, Fernando. Like that's when the term student athlete was created to try to put an emphasis on the student aspect, right? And again, these are not any of my words. This is just what the timeline shows. But that's when that term was created, and that's really when you think of modern day college athletics. I would say that's when things started. It was in the late 40s, early 50s. Now over time, maybe late 1940s, early 1950s, that's when television was being brought in. It's kind of crazy to think about that's when TV was invented only 75 years ago, right? But that's when games were being televised, football games were being televised. Football was at that time the most popular sport. And from a TV market, the best sport that translated to TV and generating an audience. So that's when football games started being televised. And it was interesting. I didn't even realize this until this morning. I just looked it up, but University of Pennsylvania was one of the first movers in actually televising football games, right? So they televised all of their own games, but it wasn't from a revenue generating standpoint. It was really to grow the audience. Then there were studies done to show, like, does actually putting games on TV, does that then deter fans from actually buying tickets and attending the game, right? So you can kind of see how some of these business aspects are getting into college sports in the late 40s and early 50s, right? At that time, there was only one game televised each week. They had guidelines where one school could not be on television multiple times throughout the season. They could only be featured one time during the year. And obviously, as these like television started growing, the audience kept growing. Some of these schools realized, hey, like, we're actually a top 15 team. There's more demand for us than a team who's not even ranked, right? That's when you have the Board of Regents of Oklahoma versus the NCAA. And that was in the 1950s as well. Or excuse me, it began in the 1950s and then kind of got pushed forward. But Oklahoma sued basically to say that they should have, and Georgia Athletic Association joined, but they should be able to negotiate their own television rights, and they should be able to negotiate for all the things that they want from a television package, right? At that time, they basically won, And there were a couple different organizations, and the NCAA was trying to limit everything, saying, no, we're the governing body, we're a voluntary organization. You don't have to join us, but you did. So you're obligated to follow our rules, right? And the Supreme Court actually went to the Supreme Court, ruled in favor of Oklahoma, and Oklahoma and Georgia won the case, meaning that they could essentially start negotiating for their televisions. However, or television contracts. However, that has now turned into, and it quickly turned into the conferences negotiating on behalf of the schools, right? Think about what we deal with now in conference realignment, and TV media rights is all dealt with through the conferences. Um, and it was funny. One of the complaints was from Oklahoma for their game against USC. It was like two top 10 teams. This was then again the 50s. You had two top 10 teams competing against each other. They received the same amount of revenue as another game that was featured. It was the Citadel against Appalachian State, and they all received the same amount of money, even though Oklahoma and USC was probably featured in hundreds of thousands of more homes, but they received the same amount of money, right? Like, it was fascinating that they brought that as one of the arguments, and it makes sense, right? So that's when you really started to see, I would say, business decisions being made without student athletes and without them really being at the table or being involved. And you had presidents and chancellors and athletic directors essentially making these decisions based on business. Now, a lot of that was really to help support scholarship funds and athletic department operating budgets. But that's really what I would say you go back to. And as I was reading some of that stuff, some of the notes I was re-looking at, like, wow, this sounds very familiar. Like, think about conference realignment just a few years ago. It was the same concept, right? Then I would say you had a pretty steady period from an NCAA governance perspective for the next maybe 50 years. Then really early 2000s is when a lot of the litigation picked up, right? There were a lot of lawsuits against the NCAA. Obviously, the O'Bannon case is a big one. There was the EA Sports case, which was another big one. We're currently dealing with what might be the biggest case right now against the NCAA from a legal standpoint that could change its governance model. But we're seeing a lot of changes right now, and a lot of it is based on money, right? A lot of it is based on generating revenue. Where does that revenue go, and what works best for the school? And I'll go back to what I said earlier. You have presidents and chancellors making decisions that are based on what's going to generate the most revenue, not necessarily what's the best overall thing to do for the athletic department or for the schools or for the student athletes, right? A lot of it is just based on what's best for the budget.
The interesting thing from all of this is that my thesis going into this conversation would have been, my main question maybe is, how has the NCAA developed or evolved over the past 120, almost 120 years, right? But it's not that the NCAA has evolved, it's that the NCAA has adapted to the world changing. So you mentioned it starts with radio, right? So the first events with rowing, it started with radio before World War II. And then it adapts to TV. And then, whoa, I have more eyeballs than you. So let me create these three divisions and then these conferences, which is what we're seeing today, right? But then there's the development of social media, which leads to NIL. So it's pretty funny to think about it that way. And I guess my question now is, essentially, we're all saying that presidents and chancellors are following the money. If they weren't, it would be pretty illogical, right? But if this whole project started off as a way to protect student athletes, to protect students that wanted to participate in clubs or extracurriculars, it's now become this whole concept of business. At this point, I don't think we can fault any of these presidents or chancellors, right? Like, I don't think we're at a point where we can say, oh, no, stick to your values, like stick to why you started it. There's no way to be idealistic about it, because if you don't play the game's going to end up playing you. Am I wrong?
No, I completely agree. I mean, if you think about it, the NCAA still does have a lot of requirements that we have to deliver on to student athletes from a sports medicine standpoint, from a professional development standpoint. We want to make sure we're a leader in providing mental health support and a lot of different aspects, right? Well, where do we get the money to be able to pay for those services as an institution, right? So yeah, you can't place any blame anywhere. Like from a business standpoint, you're going to go with the best business decision so that you can provide world class resources to your student athletes, right? So I completely agree. Like that is only logical is to follow the money because that's what you do in business. And I think that's one of the things is we have to realize that and accept and be okay with college athletics is big business, right? Like there's no hiding that anymore. I think that was something that there was a very big public perception that the NCAA, was amateur sports and they were never going to let it become quote unquote professional. And I mean, it's always been a business. I just think right now we have to understand that it is a business and we have to continue to adapt and make business decisions in order to provide all of the resources and support to our student athletes so that they can have a great experience, right? Because at the end of the day, we are all, for me, I have a job in college athletics to help benefit young people, right? And to help make sure that they have a great experience. And we can't do that. Like I'll even say, like, as a public school in the state of California, there's budget cuts everywhere that's government funded or public funded. So then, if we're making decisions from a monetary standpoint, we have to make decisions that are going to benefit us monetarily so that we can provide resources and can provide that amazing world class experience to our student athletes. So, yeah, I completely agree with you.
I think something important there that Fernando also said was that adapting of the NCAA, whether that's adapting to the new environment or being forced to adapt. And I think that's something the ACC conference might be facing right now with Clemson and Florida State. Um, we haven't really touched on it here about those kind of lawsuits and what's happening there with the ACC conference, which obviously Cal is now a part of. And I think you are kind of that perfect person for us to ask. And
Mhm.
please correct me if I'm wrong, but that's around the media rights and potential, again, conference realignment with Florida State and Clemson. Can you kind of explain what's happening there, especially with those media rights and what those two institutions are looking to do?
Yeah, definitely. So from what I understand, definitely not a legal expert, so don't take everything I say as 100% accurate. But from what I understand, Clemson and Florida State have essentially brought a lawsuit forward to try to get out of their media rights deal with the ACC so that it can provide them with an opportunity to leave the conference, right? When conferences sign a media rights deal, they typically accompany that with a grant of rights, right? That grant of rights is essentially us as Cal and other conference members in the ACC essentially signing a contract that we are going to be members of this conference for a specific number of years. Now, pretty sure that the ACC media rights deal runs through 2036. So what they're trying to do is be able to leave the conference, even though they have the opportunity to leave the conference, even though they signed the grant of rights deal along with the media rights deal through 2036. And I would assume they're doing this to see if they can potentially, whether it's enter a different conference, create a separate conference that can have a better media rights deal that's going to provide them more money. So that's stuck in the courts right now. I mean, it's interesting because they signed a contract and you're seeing it a lot publicly where it's like, well, yeah, the contract should be ironclad, right? So how does that work moving forward? If they get out of it, what kind of precedent does that set for other schools that, yeah, we signed this media rights deal for 15 years and granted rights deal, but we don't really want to do it anymore. So we're just going to rip up that piece of paper, right? So it's very interesting to see how it's playing out in the courts right now. And I think I saw yesterday that the ACC requested a discovery period of, I don't remember if it was 60 or 120 days. So really what that does is now both parties can do a bunch of research and go through the discovery phase, which kind of just punts it down the road a little bit. But yeah, it's pretty fascinating. But yeah, that's kind of how I understand it. I don't know if there was anything specifically that you were thinking of that maybe I didn't mention, but that's kind of how I understand what they're trying to do.
Do you think in the future, right now with the grant of rights and how these media rights deals work, the conference makes those deals and then kind of spreads it evenly throughout however many institutions they have in their conference? Do you think at some point we will get to the point where, let's say in the ACC, Miami gets more than Cal because of those football numbers, things like that? Do you think we'll get to a point of kind of an individualized revenue distribution?
I mean, it's possible. I mean, that's really what Clemson and Florida State are trying to
Yeah.
get, right? They're saying they're the most valuable brands in the ACC, so they deserve more money, right?
Hmm.
So I could definitely see that happening. Because right, most of the time when it comes to the media rights deals, the money is shared. The revenue is shared evenly with conference members, right? Um, However, if you're, let's say you're Clemson, right, and they were had an amazing run with their football program over the last 10 years, and they were winning national championships. They were going to the college football playoff. Like you could say they have an argument to basically that they're worth more money than I'll say Cal or Syracuse, since those are my current and former employers, because we don't have the same, like we don't compete at that same level, meaning we don't go to the college football playoff. We don't have the same amount of wins in a 10-year span. So you could argue that, but yeah, it'll be interesting, right? Like, are the strongest conference members that have the strongest football programs, are they going to flex their muscle and argue for that? And if it's only going to benefit two or three schools, are the rest of the schools in the conference going to agree to that, right? I definitely think we could see it, but it would be very interesting. I mean, that's kind of what you're seeing right now happen at the conference level with the college football playoff, right? The Big Ten and the SEC have essentially more spots in the 12 team playoff than the Big 12, the ACC, the Group of Five, and so on and so forth. So you're already seeing that at the conference level, and I could definitely see that actually coming into play with the schools in each conference.
Yeah, definitely. I think with that background and kind of looking forward to what's going to come, obviously NIL is a big component of this business evolving of college athletics. And since the passing of NIL in 2021, how has the NCAA changed along with NIL?
A lot. To simply answer, a lot, right? I mean, think about it. A lot of these decisions you kind of referenced it earlier, the NCAA has been forced to change some of their guidelines and rules because of either bills being passed at the state level, lawsuits to where they're forced, to do things or not be able to do things. Right, like California was the first state to pass an NIL bill, right? Meaning it was going to be legal for student athletes in the state of California to make money through NIL, but that was against the NCAA rule. Then you had a lot of other states basically, follow the same path and pass their own laws. Then Florida came in and said, well, yeah, you know what? That sounds great. We're actually going to make ours effective July 1, 2021, which is why NIL started in 2021 instead of 2023, right? So the NCAA had to issue interim guidance and basically came out with a few criteria as to what NIL was, right? Then maybe 6 months later, 7 months later, they had to issue like a 4-page guideline on NIL because nobody knew what to expect. It was such a strange time getting into NIL, which was, I would say, a huge shift in the NCAA from a governance standpoint. And to try to navigate that with only a few bullet points was crazy, right? But we didn't know what to expect. We didn't know what it would look like. Then, about a year or last, maybe 8 months into NIL, that's when collectives started to form, right? Like you had individuals at certain campuses, whether it was supporters, boosters, donors, you name it, like they were poking holes through this NCAA policy as a way to try to get money into student athletes' pockets, which it worked, and they poked a lot of holes through the NCAA's policy, and that's how collectives formed, and things have definitely shifted since then. Obviously, with the House settlement, I think it's going to determine a lot of what NIL will be. You've got two sides to NIL. You've got the authentic side, which is the brand deals, the social media posts, the endorsements, right? Like your true marketing campaigns. Then you've got the artificial side, which is what we see with collectives, right? Where there's a collective has essentially an account, whether it's for all sports or just one or two sports at a school. They do fundraising, they get money into that account, and then they do their own NIL deals with student athletes to pay student athletes for whatever services, whether it's a lot of work or barely any work at all. That's how that side is working. And so with the house settlement, that's been one of the things we've seen a lot of speculation on is what is the artificial NIL going to look like moving forward, right? When the judge initially threw the case back at both parties, she had asked, like, what is this enforcement mechanism? What is, this clearinghouse going to be, and how are you going to limit NIL? Like, how specifically are you going to limit NIL from donors and boosters, right? And then they came back, and it was interesting. They didn't really change much of what those guidelines were going to be. They basically took out the word booster or term booster and then replaced it with individuals that have given $50,000 or more to a school, right? So I'm still fascinated as to what that monitoring, enforcement, and clearinghouse model is going to be, because that to me will determine if the artificial NIL is still going to be a thing. Now, I think it's still going to be a thing. I just think whatever this model is, as far as monitoring and enforcement, will determine how much of an integral part of NIL it's going to be, right? Like, and what I mean by that is, like, are there still going to be donors and fundraising campaigns for collectives so that collectives can then create brand deals with athletes on top of what the essentially salary cap is going to be with the revenue share distribution?
So that's how the NCAA as an institution has evolved since NIL July 1st, 2021. I'm curious to backtrack a bit into our conversation about how you see the term student athlete evolving since 2021. So we already talked about how it started in the 50s, how it developed a little bit. What about now? What are you seeing? How true is this conversation about student athlete or athlete before student? I'll give you my thoughts in a bit, but I'd like to hear yours first.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, I was a student athlete, non-scholarship student athlete. We didn't have scholarships at my football program. I would never earned one anyways. It's okay. Um, so I don't know. I also really focused on my academics, like, as in, not to say that anybody doesn't, but like, I went to school so that I could get my education, and then I, tried out for the team, walked on, and had a great experience. But I didn't have a lot of the same, I would say, whether it's resources or requirements that I would see student athletes at the schools I've worked at, right? Like, these are the highest performing athletes on the field, and then really the highest performing students in the classroom, right? Like, I always laugh because anytime I speak to a student athlete here at Cal, I'm like, yep, I know I'm not the smartest person in the room, like, by far, right? Like, whether it's a team or it's a student athlete, I'm like, yeah, these are some really smart individuals, right? And I don't know, it's interesting to compare my perspective from being out of college for 13 years to what the modern day student athlete has to deal with in their experience. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, to me, is it an important term? Apparently, it was in the 50s and 60s when it was created. But I think we all realize that student athletes experience so much more than just their academics, and they strive for much more than just their academics, right? Like, you know everyone has a different experience, depending on what sport you play, what campus you go to, what your academic experience is. So yeah, I don't know what the replacement term could be. But, like, my football coach used to tell me that you're a student athlete, and uh you know athletics comes second, right? Like, he used to always joke with us that, like, you're an athlete first and foremost, and then you do everything else later, right? Now, having that come from your head coach, you're like, oh, okay, got it. Yeah, like, I get it, right? Like, I'm gonna put my sport first. And I think a lot of it is just dependent on your experience, what campus you go to, like I was saying earlier. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, right? Like, I think we all think from the public perspective that the NCAA created this term to really say that it's all about academics, and it's not. It's all about money, right? Like, I don't know. I can understand where that perspective comes from, but I do think that, yeah, a lot of student athletes are here to get their education and also compete at their sport and take advantage of all the resources that we at Cal provide, or any other school provides. So yeah, I guess I don't know what other replacement word there would be, but yeah, it's interesting what I think I've understood as the perception around that term.
I think one of the biggest issues with this whole debate of athlete coming before student is that I believe it only applies to the top of the top 1%. So it's a very loud minority. Whereas the reality for everybody else is you are in no way, shape, or form remotely close to QB1 at the biggest schools, to the main point guard at biggest schools, the main whatever, regardless of the sport, right?
Mhm.
You are nowhere close to them. You are still student before athlete, because to not do that otherwise, it's like, well, you're probably on scholarship, at most on stipend. That's about it, really. Like, there are very, very, very few people actually making so much money from this artificial NIL, but the headlines suggest otherwise. I think it's a really loud minority, and that's the point I wanted to get across with that
Mhm.
whole conversation. I'm not sure what you're seeing. I'm sure like data from what you've seen could back this up. Like, there's no way out of 900 student athletes at Cal that through the NILs that are being reported, uh, anything close to a majority is saying like, "Yep, I could live off of this."
Agreed. Yeah, I mean, the artificial NIL is where a bulk of, or a strong majority of dollars is being passed through, right? Um, the authentic NIL, that's nothing that I have yet to see an amount that a student athlete makes in a year that they say that they could live off of, right? Like, those are the true organic type of NIL. Now, when you think about it, from a business sense, it could make sense, right? Like, companies, from what I've seen and data that I've looked at, like, they don't like to invest marketing dollars into 18 to 22-year olds, right? It can be risky. A brand might not be fully developed. They might not be in this area. And also add in, hey, they could also transfer in 6 months and no longer be here in this area if I'm a regional brand, right? So, there's money and opportunities, but it's not nearly to the same amount as the collective type of money.
Well, with this whole evolving space these past 3 years, naturally your role has evolved as well here at Cal. For anybody that doesn't know you, that doesn't know what you do, why was this NIL role needed? And since starting, what's been your biggest takeaway as the associate athletic director for NIL at Cal Athletics?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I mean, I'll answer, I think, the second part of your question first, right? Like, what was my interest? Why did I apply for the job, and why was I grateful I got it? I mean, and why did we need it, right? Like, NIL has changed so much, right? From July 1, 2021, it changed after 6 months. It's changed almost. I mean, it's changing every day, right? And if we as a school want to make sure we're providing resources for our student athletes to be successful in whatever areas it is, right? Whether it's professional development so they can have a great resume, internships, get a job, whether they need to be provided medical treatment, whether they want to make money through NIL. Like, we want to make sure that we're providing resources so that they can be successful, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why we needed the job. Is I was working in compliance 50, 60 hours a week, and I was supposed to be overseeing the NIL component, but I was able to spend maybe 1 to 2 hours a week, which just wasn't doing justice for our student athletes, right? Like, I had people coming in for questions and asking me to look at contracts and asking me, to help write a pitch email to a company, and it's like, yeah, I'm sorry, like, send this to me. I would love to help, but I didn't have enough time to do it, right? And we wanted to make sure, especially since it was something our student athletes were obviously interested in, that we could devote someone full time to be able to provide those resources, to create educational sessions, to create partnerships with our business school and our law school, so that, again, I'm not the expert in any of these fields, but my role is to bring the experts in, whether it's to come speak to our student athletes, whether it's to set up the law clinic that we have, whether it's to, you know, meet and engage with individuals who are branding experts. Okay, cool. I'm going to connect you with a student athlete who just asked about this deal or wants to learn how to create content. And I know somebody that is really good at creating content, right? Like, we need somebody to be able to connect our student athletes with those experts, especially being in the Bay Area, right? Like, this is, you have Meta and Google, and it's known for Silicon Valley and having all these tech companies that really, that's where a lot of the authentic NIL is taking place, is all on social media. So there's no better area, in my opinion, to bring those experts from just across the bridge over to campus and help our student athletes. So that's been fun. I think that's been a really big part of what was the first 6 months of my career, or my role here, was providing education, providing resources, setting up an NIL platform so that student athletes could easily do NIL deals on an app on their phone. And then after the first 6 months, it's changed a lot, right? Like, I've been trying to facilitate deals. I've been trying to reach out to companies. I've been trying to reach out to supporters and donors to, whether it's do a deal, an NIL deal directly with a student athlete, whether it's to support the collective, which again then supports all student athletes. working with Learfield, who's our MMR partner, and they own all of our like brands and assets, right? And they work a lot with our corporate partners. So getting our corporate partners who already invested in Cal to invest specifically into our student athletes, right? So that's been a lot of fun. I mean, it's been very, I would say, external focused right now to try to bring really NIL deals to student athletes. And a lot of it is revenue generation, right? And when I say revenue generation, I mean specifically for student athletes, right? Not really for Cal, not really for obviously me or any personal gain. It's specifically for student athletes. And I've really enjoyed that, right? To see the look on a student athlete's face when you present them an NIL deal that you were able to kind of, get just by reaching out to a company or reaching out to a supporter. So that's been really cool and it's been interesting. There's been a lot of companies and organizations that have been formed to basically make money in NIL. And there's a lot of people that I meet with to kind of vet to see, okay, are they trying to take advantage of student athletes or are they actually trying to help student athletes? Like I meet with probably 5 to 6 vendors who have a solution or a way to make us money a week, right? And some of them, all right, great, thanks for the information, and do a quick follow up and don't really go anywhere. And others, I'm like, oh wow, this was amazing. Like I would love for our student athletes to have this opportunity. Um, so it's been a lot. And then recently, with the preliminary approval of the House settlement, we've been doing a ton on strategizing and planning. How are we going to implement this? What can we implement? What's going to be the best situation for our student athletes all across the board, every sport? How is this going to help us as we move forward? And think of it with that business mind. So that's been a lot. Obviously, having revenue share is completely changing the landscape of college athletics, right? Like we've always thinking of it from the amateur aspect, right? Like having to or being able to directly compensate athletes kind of changes the model in which you operate, right? If revenues are going to stay stagnant and expenses are going to increase, well, we have to be creative and figure out a way to generate more revenue and then implement revenue sharing. It's not new concept at all. It just isn't college athletics, right? Like it's how pro sports operate, right? They all have general managers, they all have these budgeting tools. We're just now bringing it into college athletics, which is it's pretty fascinating right now.
I mean, from 13 months, you mentioned 3 different phases already, naturally, because the landscape just changes every single day. I'm curious as to what the driver is for this new role. And it's very, like, the very obvious answer is, well, I mean, it's a new thing and we need the assistance. Like, I had 60 hours a week and I could only dedicate 2 of those hours to student athletes. But who is the driving force here? Is it the demand from student athletes and just serving them specifically? Or is it fulfilling a certain role for athletics? And I mention this because of your previous example, right? Whether that be the physical health of student athletes. Naturally, you will want them to take care of their bodies and to stay fit and to avoid injury or to recover from injury so that they can continue performing for the school. But in this case, NIL isn't for the school, it's for the individual. So is this like what's the connection here? Is it a recruiting tactic? Is it something that you're there to provide for the demand, like provide a supply for the demand the student athletes are looking for? Is it just to protect them? Like what's really the driving force here?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's a little bit of everything, right? Like you think of professional development, right? We provide professional development, and I mean, we have the Cameron Institute. It's the best professional development and student athlete development program that I've ever heard of, and we do that not just because the NCAA requires a minimum because they go way above that minimum, but we do that because it's in the best interest of the student athlete, right? I would say there's probably a demand from student athletes that want to get internships and to know how to write a resume and to get involved in community engagement, right? So I think I would compare it almost to professional development, right? It's not physical health where somebody twisted their ankle and we need to make sure that that ankle is taken care of from a medical perspective, they're receiving treatment and then can get back to full health and compete, right? Instead, it's like an auxiliary, I would say, right? Is it's not necessarily directly tied to you being able to play your sport, but it's something that we want to provide development on so that as an athlete, you feel like when you leave Cal, you're fully developed from every aspect, whether it's on your field of play, in the classroom, or professionally, right? So I would say it was initially driven by the demand of student athletes. I think yes, there was probably an interest from a recruiting aspect to advertise, just like we use in recruiting for the Cameron Institute, that we're providing this amazing resource, and you can receive that if you come to Cal, right? So I would say that's part of it, and then also there's a lot of like background paperwork and legal paperwork that gets done, right? Like students have to disclose their deals, they have to meet these certain eligibility thresholds, and I think that's why a lot of the times NIL roles have gone to former compliance people like myself, is because you kind of understand the NCAA requirements and the rules behind them and the state laws. Um, but I do think of it more as an auxiliary, like professional development, where I think it's moving forward, I would say, with still having demand from the student athletes, but it's kind of shifting in some of the phases, right? Like, yeah, it's shifted now more towards generating revenue than it was about providing the resources and helping the student athlete develop off of out of the classroom and off of their field of play. Because again, that's still benefiting the student athlete, but a lot of it is really driven by sort of the period that we're in. And right now it's in that generating revenue period.
I think that's really interesting just right there. And I mentioned it before of the many different hats you wear and taking that 50, 60 hours worth of compliance and now moving it directly to NIL and what you do there. And just mentioning like the Learfield teams, development teams, compliance, who, funny enough, like I was able to work with all of them and I love all of them. And now, just like in practice, what does your day to day look like in this role? Because there's so many moving parts, just I think month to month in those different phases you mentioned. So now just taking it day by day, what does that look like?
I don't even know if I have an answer for what a normal day to day looks like, right? Like it literally does change every day, right? Um, you know, a lot of the times I have student athletes hop in my office or we hop on a Zoom and I can provide guidance to them, advisement to them. Um, a lot of it is setting up partnerships with, whether it's, I was actually speaking with Professor McElhaney this morning about the class that she has in the spring and having her come in and speak with our athletes. I mean, it's a little bit of everything, right? Like I also met with somebody this morning at a company who is running a sort of a software company that would essentially help our staff be able to implement RevShare through like a general manager tool, which is awesome, right? But like it's multifaceted and each day is different, right? Each week has a different priority. It just changes so much. Like I don't know. I wear a lot of hats and I enjoy being able to work with so many different units, so many different student athletes, every sport. Like it's been a lot of fun. But I think that's been the most challenging part for me, is coming from a very rigid compliance sort of timeline, right? Like you know what to expect when you hit July 1 until June 30, right? You kind of know what deliverables are going to need to be required, what, paperwork you're going to need to do. Here are the reminder as we come up on election day. Hey, like I know to send this reminder out that you can't have practice on election day, right? Like with this, it's so there is no routine. There is no Monday through Friday. There is no typical day. Like some weeks I have, you know, over 25 hours of meetings and they're all Zoom. And other weeks I have 5 hours of meetings and I can interact more with student athletes or, go engage with a donor or local business. And yeah, once I'm able to actually get a routine, I would love it. But I'm also enjoying just kind of, flying by the seat of my pants and taking it one day at a time. But yeah, that's probably been the most challenging part, is not actually having a day-to-day routine, but it's been fun.
I think that's something we've seen, especially this past year, of being okay with being uncomfortable and like this new space and everything like that. And I think something that we've talked about on this podcast is the brand of not only the athletes, but the brand of an athletic department. And I think with this move to the ACC, Cal obviously being on the West Coast and now moving to the ACC and trying to get that brand exposure of Cal. And I think the Twitter, what's happening there with the Calgorithm has been super fun and super engaging for people who might have not known what Cal was, or UC Berkeley, getting that confused. I think there's just a lot of different aspects, but can you explain what the Golden Exchange program is and how it has worked to brand Cal Athletics now in the NIL space?
Mhm. Yeah. So Yeah, it's been a fun year from a branding perspective from Cal. It's been great. Game day and the Calgorithm has been fun. But yeah, so the Golden Exchange, it's essentially our NIL marketplace. So, right, we are software partner is Teamworks and Influencer, and it's essentially an NIL marketplace that they have the tech software for, where student athletes automatically have accounts when they enroll and when they start classes here. It's how they get their content, like their photos and videos, so naturally, they're looking at it because I know at least when I was an athlete, I always wanted the pictures of practice and competition. Right, it was great to have. So they have accounts, which is great. And then this exchange is essentially like, I always laugh when I say this, but it's kind of like a dating app almost, but for NIL, right? Like you have local businesses and fans and individuals that can sign up who are looking to do an NIL deal with student athletes, right? Then every student athlete has a profile. They can set up their own like menu items, whether it's like a social media shout out or it's an appearance or it's a lesson or it's a full on camp or autograph, right? They can set their own prices, which it's funny. That seems to be one of the biggest questions of student athletes is what price should I set? Like, I don't know what to put here. I don't want to go aim too high or keep it too low and miss out on making money. So that this menu card. And then from there, I vet the individuals and the companies that sign up to make sure they're legitimate, right? Like, again, I want to make sure that in my role, I can help protect our student athletes from anyone who's trying to take advantage of them. All right, because you see horror stories on the internet and everywhere about people taking advantage of student athletes and try to offer them a deal and end up, whether it's a scam or any type of fraud scheme. So I kind of vet them, make sure that they are a legitimate business or a legitimate individual, and then from there the student athletes can reach out to the businesses or the individuals or vice versa once they're approved, and then they can essentially negotiate or come to terms on a deal, and then it can happen right through the app. They can have receive the money through the app, and then they follow up on whatever deliverable it is. If it's a social media post, they'll post it, take a photo of that or screenshot of it and then post it to the exchange, and it's automatically uploaded to us, which is great from a disclosure standpoint. But it's a great way to bring people together who, you have student athletes that are looking to do NIL activities, and then you have individuals and businesses that, again, are interested in working with student athletes. So it kind of brings people together, which is great.
On the education portion, obviously, I mean, it's UC Berkeley, right? That's what we're talking about here. So there's a big education portion to it. And there's plenty of educational opportunities offered for student athletes within Cal Athletics. One being the class that Professor Kelly teaches on NIL, who you just mentioned that you had a meeting with. She's been on this podcast before. So, what do these opportunities really look like for student athletes when it comes to the educational aspect of it?
Yeah, so definitely. I mean, obviously, we pride ourselves on providing world-class educational resources. Sorry, Elise, if I misunderstood your question. I thought you were asking about the exchange specifically, so that's why I answered it that
No,
way.
no, I
But
was. I was. It was great.
okay, good. So yeah, so like the Golden program, right? Like the exchange is part of that. The educational resources are part of that. We've been able to set up, like we started it with a speaker series 2021 where we brought in Professor McElhaney, we brought in experts to kind of talk through a few different aspects, right? The first was we brought influencer in to talk about social media, creating content, how to get verified, right? Like all of the key questions that student athletes want to know when they're navigating social media from an NIL perspective. Kelly McElhaney about personal brand, about values-based branding, which was awesome. Financial literacy was a topic, right? So we started with that, and I would say it's grown from there. So now we actually have a formal partnership with Haas, and they have two classes. One is the class you mentioned that Professor McElhaney teaches, UGBA 192T3. I got the title of it this morning, so there we go. But it's essentially built for NIL, right? Like it's built for student athletes to understand their own values, their own personal brand, and then how once they have that understanding, how to put that into practice when doing NIL deals and marketing deals with companies. So it's awesome. It's available to anybody that is an undergrad, doesn't have to be a business major. So that's great. We have a law clinic, or excuse me, before I move on there, we have a class that Professor Eder, it was supposed to launch this past fall, but it's being pushed back, but it's on financial literacy. Up to 250 student athletes can take it. It's a 2-unit class. I mean, everybody that went to Cal or is involved in athletics at Cal knows Professor Eder, right? He's pretty world renowned. And he's the expert when it comes to financial literacy. He used to do more of a practicum class with like 5 to 10 athletes, and a lot of those were athletes that have gone on to be professionals and very successful professionals, whether it be Olympians, whether it be PGA Tour pros or NFL pros, you name it. And he kind of teaches them the key aspects of financial literacy, right? Probably to levels that I would never understand because I would never be able to make the amount of money that a professional athlete does. But it's really cool. And now it's open from 5 to 10 to 250 athletes. So it's awesome. It's a 2 credit class too, which is great that student athletes are actually getting credit for it. So that's the partnership with Haas. There's a law clinic set up with the law school here at Cal, where this would actually be a fascinating class to take, but it's a law school class specifically on legal issues related to NIL, right? Think about all the things we've talked about in the last almost hour, right? It's all the legal issues related to the NCAA and especially NIL. And I'm sure the curriculum for that has to change probably at least every semester, if not more. Um, so there's school students. I spoke to the class last year, and I think it was mostly 2L and 3L students, but um, they're learning to become lawyers and learning specifically related to NIL, and they will perform free legal services for student athletes. So whether it's just looking through a contract advisement, negotiation, anything that you can think of from a legal aspect, they'll perform those services for free. And it's an awesome resource for our student athletes to feel like they have protection when entering into NIL, which is awesome. And then it also gets experience for the students, which, I mean, everybody wins there, in my opinion, and it's great. And the nice thing is there's 3 professors in that class that will all also look over every piece of work that the students are doing. So they can, like, our student athletes can feel comfortable that it's actually great advice and legal advice. So that's good. So those are the partnerships we have set up. We also bring in experts from the area. We're bringing in a lot of financial literacy experts, so like wealth management folks, on into campus to meet with teams. There's an NCAA requirement and a state law requirement that we have to provide that. So for those individuals that may not be taking Professor Etter's class, they still need to get that information, right? Like, it's critical information if you're making money in NIL, and even if you're not, like, as you set up a budget, right? How much money do you have to spend a month, a week? Like, what are you going to do if you actually have a little bit of extra money? Are you going to save money to pay your taxes? So it's great information. Setting up team meetings there. We actually are going to create a new session this year on social media and content creation. One of our staff members that works in our creative services office is really, really, really an expert in that area and is going to work with the Warriors this season. So she's going to do her own session, which is awesome. And then it's really bringing in brand experts to kind of talk through, and former athletes to talk through, like, their guidance, what worked for them, and try to be an expert in the areas that I think would be really beneficial to our student athletes.
And I think the follow-up question to all of that is, you're doing all this amazing work. The first one is, how do you have student athletes find out about these opportunities? And how many are actually taking advantage of all of this?
It's a great question. In the beginning, so 2021, 2022 academic year, we were still kind of in the COVID protocols, right? Where everything was still via Zoom. I'd say, we had not a ton of student athletes attend, right? It's grown a little bit. I mean, the way I'm trying to message it is through my normal channels of communication. So whether that's Teamworks, whether that's getting to coaches, sending emails. What I've really tried to do, and we have a student athlete advisory committee rep specifically for NIL. She's amazing, very successful in NIL, and she communicates with the SAC group so that they're all aware. And we try to set up events where there's going to be SAC members who attend, and then get them to tell their friends and teammates and everybody. So try to grow it a little bit organically, but it's hard, right? If there's no requirement to it, what's your incentive to go unless you're extremely interested in NIL, right? Like, I know, when I was an athlete a long time ago, the last thing I wanted to do was come back to campus after going to class all day and, waking up early for lift and then having practice. And it's like, I just want to sit on my couch for a little bit, right? So I think that's been the struggle, has been trying to get more participation. So I think this year I'm really focused on trying to meet student athletes and teams where they are, rather than trying to say, hey, we have an open event tonight at 7 p.m. Come get your free cold pizza, right? Like, what's the incentive to that unless it's something that you're really passionate about? So I think that's been a challenge, but I'm really trying to grow it organically. I don't want anybody to feel like they're forced to show up to an NIL event or NIL related event if they're not interested, right? But I want them to know and be aware of, the resource that they have. Because again, I feel like that's part of my role is to make sure that if you want NIL resources and support, you know where to find it and can then also get that help, right? So we're trying to grow it. If you guys have any tips, I mean, you're more recent student athletes than me, so any tips, let me know.
I think something right there is meeting student athletes where they're at. And just anecdotally, like you've worked with my teammates a lot this past couple months in terms of NIL and just having opportunities there for them. And that's been so amazing to hear. I know they are very appreciative and they love doing things like that. So, from the brands coming to you, how do you dictate which sports to prioritize?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't dictate what sport, right? Like I actually take pride in that because I don't want to be the one who's deciding what sport gets what NIL opportunities. Typically when a brand or company comes to me and they're looking for student athletes that they want to work with, I'll kind of ask them what their criteria is, right? And then based on that criteria, it might be, we're looking for a student athlete in a male sport or a female sport, or a student athlete that has 10,000 or more followers on Instagram. Well, I'll kind of pull a list of student athletes that meet that criteria and then oftentimes communicate to those individuals, this opportunity is available. Please let me know if you're interested. Right. So I really try to make it the brand's decision rather than my decision because I don't want that burden. Right. Like I also don't want to, be accused of preferential treatment or that, there's certain individuals that are or teams that are more favored. Like I want to make sure more than anything that we're adhering to what the criteria is of the brand so that they get their goals met, have a good experience, and then come back for more NIL deals with student athletes.
When brands do come to you, I'm assuming that's through the Golden Exchange, right? Or is it separate to that?
It happens in really every type, like any type of way, right? Like, I think when people initially reach out, I'll tell them about the exchange, but I also don't want that to be because they're required to register for the exchange, right? And sometimes as soon as you get to a registration page, whether you're reading an article or, you're anywhere on your phone, right? The first thing you do when you have a registration page, "Oh, I'm going to click out of that. Like, I'm not going to do that, right? So like, I'm trying to prevent that from being a barrier to brands or companies in entering an NIL deal with student athletes. So it can be the NIL exchange. It can be me helping arrange, facilitate. There's a lot of times it's based on referrals, right? Like whether it's a donor or a supporter, a fan, like they'll reach out to me and say, "Hey, I was talking to somebody who's looking for a student athlete. Like, here's their contact information," and I'll reach out to them, and then we'll get an NIL deal done. So it can happen in really any number of ways.
Okay, because I know through the Golden Exchange, there are the profiles for the student athletes. And then I'm assuming how it works is you click directly on that student athlete, and that's how the connection takes place.
Mhm.
But when brands reach out to you, are they saying, "Oh, I'm looking for this student athlete specifically," or "I'm looking for a student athlete from this sport"? Like, how would you narrow that down?
Yeah, a lot of times when brands come directly to me, they're almost looking for like they have a specific criteria they're looking for to meet whatever campaign they're running, right? And so they won't typically say, "Oh, I'm looking for X student athlete," right? Like that might happen with your, like you said earlier, the QB1, right? Like it might happen with a Fernando or a Jaden Nod or the probably the more notable student athlete because they have more brand recognition than others. But really, like they'll come to me and give me a criteria, and then I'll just go based off of whatever that criteria is.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, it's so wild, like how to pick and how the revenue, non-revenue works, and it's just an overall mess. I think just to start closing out here, with these roles and everything you're seeing, could you even predict how you see your role developing as a director of NIL?
Could I predict what it is now, or you mean like 12 months from now? Can I predict what it's going to look like?
I mean, yeah, I initially my question was for the next few years, but I don't even think
Yeah.
years would be a fair question.
I mean, I would say if I could tell you what my role is going to be in the next like 8 to 9 months from now, I'd be a very rich man because then I would be able to like tell schools what to be doing from a consulting standpoint from now until then, right? Like, I don't know. Like, I know when I first got into this role, I was told I needed to be flexible and be able to adapt and just, go with whatever the changes are. And I've definitely had to do that. Like, I have no idea. Like, I could be the person that is still in the same role, right? Helping facilitate broker NIL deals. I could also be the person that clicks pay and the revenue share distribution. I could be the person that comes up with the contract. I could be the person that manages whatever deliverables are in that contract. I could be the person that negotiates the rev share contract. So like there's so many different avenues. And I think really what I've realized, and especially now, is like there's going to be a there's going to be need to be a team of people doing all of these things moving forward if we want to be successful in it and if we want to provide the right resources to our student athletes. So um, hopefully once we're done recording here, then we can get that recording to Jim Knowlton and tell him all the support we need to help our student athletes here at Cal in the NIL space.
Yes, definitely. Um, Last question here to wrap up, and also kind of a big picture, I would say. Um, in the context of the House settlement, looming employment status, and that NIL collective involvement, where do you think we're headed in terms of the college athletics landscape in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I would say I envision an employment type of model, an employment type of relationship with schools and with student athletes. Now, I think we're a few years away from something like that, right? But like, if you think about it, if a student athlete's going to sign a contract and then they're going to receive compensation, like, isn't that typically what happens with an employer versus employee? There's a lot of things that still need to get figured out. There's obviously a few NLRB cases right now with Dartmouth. There's one with USC. So like, there's a few things that still need to go through the legal process. But like, I think it makes sense, right? Like if you have this salary cap, if you have this or rev share distribution, pardon my terminology there, but like that's essentially what it is. So if you have a salary cap, if you have distribution of funds for deliverables, like it only makes sense that they would create an employer and employee relationship. And to be honest, I think it would be a good thing. Now, does that fit for every sport? I don't know. Like, at least I know you've been very vocal that there is no one size fits all approach to any of this, right? And what works for football is definitely not going to work the same as it does for women's gymnastics or for men's soccer. So, you know, do we see more sports specific models out there when it comes to governance and when it comes to employment or non-employment? Like I think we might be headed in that direction where things go a little bit more sport specific. I mean, you're already seeing discussions of a super league for football where, the top 70 teams and then there's relegation. And then from there, like maybe even the 30 team, like, super conference. So, you know, in that vein, like to me, that is essentially a sport specific model. And I think a lot of us have always wondered, like, okay, if football does its own super league, then what does that mean for Olympic sports? Does that mean Olympic sports go back to more of a regional conference type of model? And I think that would make sense, right? Like, especially for us being in our first year in the ACC, like it would make sense to travel regionally, not from coast to coast. But I think there's still a lot of things that need to work through, whether it's the legal process, whether it's the NCAA governance process before we get there. But I would say, like, if I had to make one prediction, I would think we do have some type of employment model. How that works, not quite sure, but that would probably be my prediction.
Well, awesome. I think that's a great prediction, and I agree with that.
What do you think? Yeah, I was gonna say, what do you guys think?
I agree. Like I've talked to I feel like my perspective has changed a lot since talking to office of presidents till now, being post grad, like working at one of these like networks. There's like so many moving parts that um I think add to a lot of different layers of what's to come in the future. But I agree with the employment take there, and still from whenever I talk to the the office presidents, it's been one size fits all for however many years, and that's just not where we're at anymore in this landscape. And I think the NCAA is going to consistently get themselves in trouble if they try and continue to do this one size fits all model. But who knows? Who knows what's going to happen?
And even on the flip side to that, because I do agree with Elise, like it is not a one size fits all. My biggest worry, or where I'm personally keeping my eyes on, is what's going to happen to Olympic sports. I see that the NCAA really, really, really just produces so many Olympians for the U.S. in the development, not even just student athletes, but even pro athletes for the Olympics. So I'll be very, very curious to see once employment inevitably comes in and sports start getting cut because there isn't enough money for the business to work out. What's that going to do to the results of the United States Olympic team every 4 years? I am very, very curious to see what will happen there.
Yeah, I mean that's a fascinating topic, right? I think we could talk for an hour on that topic alone. I agree with you, especially having the Olympics this past summer, going into the House settlement being preliminarily approved. Like, these are of the utmost importance right now as we think about what the House settlement and its effects could do to the Olympic sports, right? Like, you think about what college athletics has become, it's essentially become the training ground for the USOPC, right? Like that's essentially what it is, and it's amazing. It's an amazing resource for our country, for our Olympic teams. But if you eliminate opportunities, like what is that? What are those effects going to be? Are we still going to be leading the medal count every 4 years? I don't know. I hope so, but at some point, something's got to give, right? So yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Well, Justin, thank you so much for your time, your knowledge. We got to steal an hour of your time. Thank goodness. Um, it's been so good to talk to you again. Like I said earlier, you were very, very impactful in my time here at Cal and just my interest in this whole landscape. So thank you so much for not just today, but for the past 4 years.
Thank you so much, Justin. I mean, on my side, you know how much I appreciate your knowledge and information, and I'm so glad we got to do it here as well. So thank you truly for your time.
Yeah, no problem at all. Always happy to help. You both are amazing people, amazing human beings, and no, it's been great to stay connected. And I'm glad that things are going so well. And honored to be invited on the podcast. Hopefully, hopefully I didn't do too bad for you. But yeah, I really appreciate it. Always a pleasure. And whatever else I can do, let me know. Always here to help.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. You were amazing, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll do a part two sometime in the future as well.
Deal, deal. I'll be a recurring guest.
Awesome. Well, to everybody that watched on YouTube or listened on Spotify, thank you guys so much. If you're on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you're on Spotify, please follow the podcast. That is it for today, and we will see you all next week.
Bye.